Hey guys, so ultimately, I'm actually back in my hotel room again. I was hoping to go see the waterfall, but it's not going to happen because it was raining pretty badly a few hours ago. Uh, I think it's still raining. Um, so that brings me to my next sort of issue. What do you look for when you travel? Like, if you want to settle down, what do you look for that makes you, gauge whether or not a city or a country is on the way up or on the way down or just kind of just getting by? And, you can look at the numbers. The numbers are always good. There's a lot of them, though. And though you don't know how to create, I think, at least not at first, you don't know how to create an algorithm that's going to be very helpful because even if you use money, or sorry, even if you use data or you buy the algo, it's very difficult to see whether or not the underlying numbers, whether they're from private or public or nonprofit firms, are reliable. So you notice a lot of this in hedge funds. They will, come up with they will be enthralled with a new mathematical algorithm or something to do with quants, and suddenly they'll be off to the races. But of course, if it was that easy, 2008 would have been predictable. And I think that if you go back in hindsight, you can see that 2008 was predictable if you had your eyes open. But if you were looking at the numbers, it probably wasn't going to help you. I mean, the numbers were telling you that home ownership was on the way up, everything was fine. You could probably look at the numbers all day and not necessarily see, at least you could. That's not true, actually. If you saw the right numbers, you might have been able to predict the crisis. The real problem is getting access to those numbers, many of which are proprietary. So yeah, if you could look at non-dischargeable loans as a percentage of a banking of a bank's revenue, you could probably do a pretty good job. But almost nobody has access to those kinds of numbers. So for travel purposes, right, the question is, what can you just rely upon with your two eyes to see? And I think number one is the weather. It's frustrating to just walk outside and suddenly be inside a mall and not be able to leave for an hour, just simply because suddenly there's torrential rain for another hour. So being stuck an hour somewhere after having a meal, and when you just want to go back to your hotel and relax, if you keep doing that all the time, it makes even a wonderful place difficult to stay in. I just walked back in the rain, and that's fine with me. But I've got a slight cold. It's not very comfortable. It's not a huge problem. But if I had to do this every day, I think it would be, especially because it's so unexpected. When you're along the equator, weather is very unpredictable. And so this is a pretty much rainy season in much of Southeast Asia between November and I don't know I don't know how long, but it's probably quite frustrating. Whereas with snow, you wake up, it's there, you need a jacket, you put on your jacket, you put on your hat, you put on your mittens and your gloves, and you're good to go. Hopefully, and it's actually not as bad as something that's unexpected. So when you're traveling, number one, look at the weather. Number two, this ties into the weather. Look at pollution. When I was in India in 2010, that's the first thing that hit me is how much pollution there was. It's not easy to live in a place where you got to wear a mask all the time. Even if you wear a mask, I'm not sure how much it helps. But it affects everything. I mean, it affects your ability even to go outside and just jog. And if you can't really go outside, because either it's too hot or you have to meet everyone in the mall, because it's too hot outside or too polluted, it creates a lot of problems. So they go together. So like with weather, a lot of countries that are very hot have just what they do is if they have the money, they build a lot of shopping malls. But when you put air conditioning in a shopping mall, it actually pushes out the hot weather. And when you push out the hot weather, you actually increase the temperature outside slightly. We don't know the effects of constant air conditioning all the time. We probably know it's not going to be very good. I feel like Singapore has gotten hotter in 2018 compared to when I was there in 2001. But again, I couldn't tell you by how much. And I certainly couldn't tell you whether or not it's because of the air conditioning. It could be because they built more asphalt roads, but I really couldn't tell you why. But the combination of different things is what you want to look for. Very rarely is one thing going to create an impact. It's always going to be a combination of different things. And so you look at weather, you look at pollution. Pollution also stunts growth. So if you want to have a family one day, you want to stay as far away from pollution as you possibly can. So some people might add climate change to that whole bucket. I don't think that, they say that so many cities will be underwater, whether it's Venice, whether it's Jakarta. You look at that, and there's not a whole lot you can do about that as an individual. And so I wouldn't put climate change on my list simply because it's something that's happens hopefully gradually. And I'm not a scientist, but with pollution, you can measure it immediately. You know exactly what the level of pollutants are. Whether you're in California during wildfire situation or whether you're here, I mean, you know exactly what's going on in the moment, which means the data is more reliable. So you want to look at that, weather, pollution, and also diversity. It's not a whole lot of fun being in a place where you're the only person who looks like you. And so you want to be in a place where the country has had a history of attracting people who come voluntarily and stay voluntarily, and hopefully get married, have children, and sort of invest their time and their money and their energy in that place. That's ultimately the holy grail of what everyone is looking for, what all governments are looking for, and all businesses, because you can't have governments rely on businesses for tax revenue. You don't get tax revenue unless you sell something or unless you, I suppose there's other ways of doing it, but ultimately it comes down to selling domestically or internationally. If you have oil, that's obviously a big jump ahead of the queue. And if you don't have oil, it becomes more difficult. Hopefully you have a port nearby where you can charge people for bringing products into your country and then shipping those out. You have to have some sort of specialty that you can sell in order to have a stable situation. Otherwise you might have a situation where the government is simply selling. You can think of many examples. Weapons being one of them. You can look at a lot of different things. But with diversity, the idea really is that how do we get the best people all over the world to come to settle down and to essentially provide input in ways that help everyone. And that is probably the most difficult thing to accomplish because it relies on a mixture of propaganda, of being friendly, of being open, of being tolerant, while at the same time maintaining existing infrastructure and existing status groups. And we call that social cohesion for shorthand, but it's very difficult to have that over the long term. Most countries tend to resort to segregation. Once you have segregation, it's the beginning of the end, simply because it's very difficult to defend yourself from actors that want to disrupt societal cohesion. If you have the more isolation you have, the more difficult it is to have social cohesion. And so that's something that a lot of countries are learning right now. So you want to look at diversity. So that also might explain why so many Koreans commit suicide. South Korea has, I think, one of the highest suicide per capita rates in the world. If you go to South Korea, they all almost pretty much very resemble each other. It's also got one of the highest rates of plastic surgery all over the worldwide. So it's not just South Korea, obviously. You can go to Tonga, a lot of different smaller islands as well. So ultimately, the key thing is it's good to have a country where people look different, where they have different skin tones, different it's good to have that, and it's something that is a little bit new, especially if you're an island, because air travel for human history hasn't happened all that long. Neither have trains in terms of mass numbers. So for the most part, countries that are diverse have been diverse because of war or having refugees coming in, whether it's Iran accepting Afghan refugees, or you could look at a few Armenians that came in. There hasn't always been tight border control, and so you have a lot of refugees, and that's been the not just it's climate change refugees. You have a lot of economic refugees and a lot of war refugees. So that's really, if you go to America, for example, the Vietnam War, you have a situation where you're also trying to take the best people out of that country and bring them to your country in order to have a positive impact, hopefully for everyone involved, as a result of an unfortunate situation. And so even though America lost the Vietnam War, it was able to take a lot of Vietnam's smartest people and most ambitious people. And as a result, if you go to San Jose, California today, there's a little Saigon or a little Vietnam, depending on what you want to call it. And that wouldn't be there. It wouldn't add to the flavor or the diversity of San Jose, had we not had the had the Vietnam War not happened. So, you have to look at that, but hopefully you don't need war in order to get diversity. That's the worst of all. That's the worst way to get it. So the question is, how do you get it without voluntarily? That's something to look for, and you can see that with your own eyes when you go someplace. You can see it. And I think that beyond that, you're looking at public infrastructure. Public infrastructure is difficult. I mean, it's based on the city. It's not. You can't really go by country. Obviously, Tokyo is far beyond anyone else. The train stations function as sort of underground shopping malls for the most part. They are worlds unto themselves. That's what happens when you spend a lot of your money on domestic infrastructure instead of war. And I think the U.S. now spends about 4 to 5% of its GDP on war. Other countries like Germany only spend about 1.5%. Canada about 1%. I'm guessing Japan probably is about the same, about 1.5%. Just looking at being able to see what they've done in Tokyo and Osaka and a lot of other places with the public infrastructure. But there are some other success stories. You're looking at Palembang in Indonesia, a place nobody's really heard of, unless you work in the oil business, and they have a nice tram system. And like I said, it really depends on what you want to spend your money on. So this is it. I mean, it's something to look for, but at least it gives you a list of things to look for with your own eyes. And I've sort of droned on too long, and I apologize. I'm a bit sick, but hopefully that helps. And I hope all of you do well, and I hope all of you had a great Thanksgiving if you're in the U.S. And I guess I'll keep traveling and see how things go. Take care.